All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I am Jacqueline from Ryman Gardens. I work in the education department here, and I am very excited to welcome Melissa Burdick, who is the director of the Brenton Arboretum. And with that, Melissa, please take it away.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for having me today. It's kind of a gorgeous day outside, so hopefully everybody's going to get a chance to go out and enjoy some sunshine and fall color a little bit. But I appreciate having the chance to talk to you guys. This is my first ever Zoom presentation. I've had Zoom meetings, but never a presentation, so bear with me. Hopefully it'll go off without any hitches at all. Like Jacqueline said, my name is Melissa Burdick. I'm Executive Director of the Brenton Arboretum. And my button is not... Oh, there we go. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Brenton Arboretum, we are very close to you guys up at Ryman Gardens. We're just south of Dallas Center, Iowa. There's a little map there if you wanted to see, kind of get an idea of how close we are. We're just about a 1-hour car trip away. Our mission at the Arboretum is to inspire joy through the beauty and knowledge of the natural world of trees. And this little photo here is one of my absolute favorites. It kind of shows you the scope of the Arboretum, and the lakes and prairies and ponds and all of our collections are really quite beautiful and well worth a visit. And I'll tell you a little bit more about us. We are 140 acres. Actually, we're a little bit larger than that now. We have had some land donated to us. We're about 148 acres. We are a public charity, a 501c3 institution. We started planting trees in 1997, so just about everything you see at the Arboretum is about 21 years old. So it's pretty impressive to see some of the size of our collections and how they've really grown and are really starting to come into their own and mature. Before it was an Arboretum, it was just a cow pasture, so nothing but brome grass that the cows would graze on. So it's kind of a magical transformation. We have about 2,500 trees and shrubs planted in our collections, and that represents 500 different species and cultivars. And just about every tree that I'm going to talk about today is planted at the Arboretum. So if you are excited to see any of them in person, you can come out to the Arboretum and check them out. All of our trees are labeled, and one of the best things about the Arboretum is that we are open every day, every single day, unless there's too much snow to get down the gravel road. We are on a day, and we are free. We don't charge admission. So that's a great opportunity if you have a big family and you don't want to have to pay admission for, 2 adults and 5 or 6 kids, and you just need something to do to keep them busy. You can come to the Arboretum for free and spend an entire day here and get thoroughly worn out, which is great if you have lots of kiddos who need to take a nap in the afternoon. You can bring your dogs. Dogs are welcome to the Arboretum, which is one of our biggest features. People love to bring their dogs. We've got trails, ponds, streams, man-made restored prairies. One of our most popular features is a nature playscape, which is basically a playground made of entirely natural materials, and kids absolutely love it. You can bring a picnic. We have lots of educational programs. They're cut back quite significantly this year because of coronavirus, but normally we do have a lot of fun activities going. We are doing a fun new series this year. It's called a Health and Wellness series. And I think coming up, it's either Saturday or Sunday this week, is wine and yoga. Sunset wine and yoga. So you kind of take 3 awesome things, yoga, wine, and the sunset, and smush them all together and have a really, really great evening or afternoon. So check that out on our website or on our Facebook page. And we are supported by memberships. And so if you come out and if you like what we do, we would love you to become a member and help support us that way. So I highly encourage you to come out and visit and enjoy one of the many different botanical institutions in central Iowa that are really make this place kind of a Midwest horticultural mecca. And I don't think I'm exaggerating too much to say that, but some really great stuff is happening horticulture and garden wise around here. So we are really excited to be a part of that. So come check us out. Now, we're going to talk about bees and specifically how to use the woody plants in your landscape or in your garden to support bee populations. And we're going to talk a lot about honeybees, but there are many other native bees that are important pollinators. Here's a little poster that I snagged a picture from the internet, and you can actually buy this poster. I think Amazon will sell the poster, or this one is from Man Nature Network. I think Man and Nature Network is where this one is from. Excuse me, Mother Nature Network. And it just describes all the different kinds of bees and shows pictures of them. Many of them are native to North America. The honeybee is not native to North America, if you didn't know that. That's kind of an interesting thing. It's very important to a lot of our crops and economic activities here in the US, but it's not native. So it's kind of amazing to think about how important it's become to the US, even though it's not native. And in addition to that, there's the mason bees and carpenter bees and everybody's favorite bumblebee and all kinds of different species in the family. Now, when it comes to bees, and I'll kind of start talking specifically about honeybees right now, but many of the same things apply. Bees love nectar, and flowers have evolved with bees, and they use nectar to attract bees to them, and then the bees, of course, act as a pollinator. But nectar is a bee's source of energy. It's kind of the sugar, well, basically the sugar that kind of gives them the energy that they need. A bee will use their proboscis to suck the nectar into their honey stomach. And if you can believe it, a bee will need to visit between 100 and 1,500 flowers to fill up the honey stomach, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. Of course, many of the flowers they're visiting are very tiny, not a lot of nectar, so you have to do a lot of work to get enough nectar to then be full and head back to the hive. Once they get back to the hive, the bees will pass the nectar mouth to mouth from one bee to the next, which is actually kind of gross when you think about it. It's gross when I think about it. But as they pass it from one bee to the next, there are enzymes and other chemical reactions that happen that reduce the moisture content of the nectar. And by the time it's ready to be stored as honey, it'll go from a moisture content of about 70% to 20%. Basically, they just condense it down, condense the nectar down, and then they can store it in a cell in the hive. And it's honey. And they use that honey to feed the larvae. We'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. Okay, bees love nectar. Bees also love pollen. Pollen is a protein source for the bees. So when I first started studying, I thought, oh, pollen just accidentally got stuck to the bees, or it's a byproduct of the pollination or the bee honey making process. But no, actually bees harvest the pollen specifically in addition to the nectar and bring it back to the hive. And you've probably, if you've looked close at a bee, you've probably noticed their little, they're called a corbicula. And I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen. You can see it? Great, thanks, Jacqueline. So the corbicula is just a fancy word for the little pockets or pouches where they'll store their pollen, kind of like their fanny pack as they're out gathering nectar, and they'll bring it back to the hive. And of course, you see down here in the bottom left corner, the bee will happen to get pollen all over them, and as they travel from one flower to the next, what they don't pack away in their fanny pack, their corbicula, they'll will rub off on another plant and help pollinate it. Now, the stored pollen plus the mouth enzymes and honey are all combined. The bees chew it up and spit it out, and it basically makes a product called bee bread. And that is what's used to feed the larva, the new brood. And one of the things that just absolutely fascinates me when I look in beehives, and Jacqueline and I were talking before the program, I have kept bees in the past. I'm not a great beekeeper, so I am not going to give advice on how to do it. But it is an enjoyable pastime, and if you're interested in it, there's a lot of resources to learn how to become a beekeeper and start dabbling in that hobby. But one of the things that absolutely blew my mind when I first started keeping bees was looking at the cells where the pollen is stored and seeing the amazing color variation between the different pollens. So you see in this picture here, there's kind of greenish, there's mustard yellow and orange and red and pale yellow. And it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful to see all those different colors and know that each one of those pollen cells probably was one specific type of flower that was blooming that the bee visited that day. So it's kind of a fun thing, kind of a neat geeky thing to enjoy when it comes to bees. What's also amazing is how heavy beehives can get. You got the weight of the bees, obviously, the weight of the larva, the weight of the wax, the weight of the pollen, and the weight of the honey that's in there too. And a beehive can easily weigh, one unit can easily weigh 100 pounds. And when you think about those stacks of beehives, and I'll show pictures at the end of the program, when you think about those stacks of boxes and there's hives and honey all the way through, I mean, you could have a ton of weight, literally a ton, in some of these complexes, and it's pretty cool to think about. Okay. Oh, my forward button is giving me, oh, there we go. It's beeping at me and not doing what I wanted it to. All right, so besides nectar and pollen, bees also need water, and it helps keep them cool. It keeps the larva moist. Larvae are basically, this is gonna be gross, but they're basically the maggot stage, the larva stage of the bee. And so they need to be kind of moist and cozy in their little cells as they're growing and developing. And the water also helps dilute the honey and help create the bee bread that we talked about a minute ago. So when you're thinking about creating landscapes or spaces for bees, or in your neighborhood or in your yard, remember that they need to have a pretty easy source of water to get to. When it comes to locating your hives, where you want to put them, you usually want to put them fairly close to a water system, maybe a lake, a pond, a stream, or something along those lines. There's a couple of ideas here. There's a bird bath, and interestingly here, that's old wine corks floating in the bird bath, and that gives the bees a place to land. So instead of just being around the rim, they can be all throughout it. This one is an old, I think it's a pet automatic watering dish with rocks in it, so the bees can land on the rocks and get the water. One of the things that I think is interesting is that bees are perfectly fine with really skunky water. It doesn't have to be crystal clear, mountain spring water. It can be literally the gutter or the ditch or something. They're okay with that. And sometimes they might even prefer it because maybe, I don't know, flavor? I don't know. All right, now bees in trees. Obviously, you think of Winnie the Pooh getting into the honey tree, and of course, that's where bees would naturally build their hives. On this slide here, you can see an exposed hive. It is extraordinarily rare to find anything like that in Iowa, and it certainly would not survive a winter because it would just be too cold. This one is a photo from California, but it's pretty amazing to see the structures that they build right on the branch of this tree. Most of the time when you find or discover wild honeybees in our neck of the woods, they're going to be in a tree structure or in a hollow of a tree, like the example on the right side of the screen here. And there are plenty of wild bees out there. They're not native, like I mentioned, but they are not anyone's particular crop or livestock animal that they're keeping on purpose. They've just formed their own hive. And sometimes beekeepers like to try and catch a wild hive while it's swarming. And it's an interesting process to do. I've never done it myself, but basically you kind of put a beehive out near them or put a box over it, and they just make themselves at home. You close the box and take them home back to your hives. It's a pretty cool process. All right, now we are going to start talking about beautiful tree recommendations. And I have to apologize for the silly pun, but I couldn't help myself. So we're going to start with the big trees and work our way down to smaller trees and then to littler trees, the shrubs. and more kind of almost ground covers. And I do have a plant list that you can request. I think we just need you to send your email address and the request to Jacqueline. Do you want to give that email address now, and then we'll give it again at the end?
Sure. So the email address, if anybody has questions, is rgeducation. And let me get this it'll be rgeducation@iastate.edu. And we have some information that we can share with everybody if you're interested. That has a list of the trees from Melissa.
Yep. And we'll mention that again towards the end if you miss anything. Of course, if you have a paper and pen, you can jot it down as we go along. But here we go. Let's dive in. Let me do a time check to be sure I'm on track. Don't want to go too fast or too slow. The first one I want to talk about is the linden, the Tilia americana. This is a native tree, and it is absolutely the poster child for pollinators and supporting pollinator habitats. The reason is because it is absolutely loaded with flowers in the springtime. They smell amazing. They're beautiful. And the trees will absolutely hum in the springtime with the sound of bees and all other kinds of pollinators just swarming it, enjoying the nectar and the pollen from it. Excuse me. Now, when it comes to linden, we're starting to have a really tough time with linden in Iowa because of the Japanese beetles. The linden collection at the Brenton Arboretum suffers every year. When the beetles come out, they eat it down and skeletonize it, and they look pretty bad, which is a shame, but it never kills the trees. The Japanese beetles don't eat to the point that they can actually kill a tree. They just make them look really rough. They still flower in the springtime. They still have beautiful foliage right until the Japanese beetles move in mid-summertime. And then they'll lose their foliage in fall, the same as usual, and then resprout again and be just fine the next spring. So we're starting to ask ourselves, well, what do? We want to have lindens. We want to have a great pollinator option for the bees, but we also don't want to have these poor eaten trees taking up a big part of our landscape. So we're starting to ask ourselves, what can we do to help make everybody happy and keep the Arboretum looking beautiful too. So there are different cultivars and different species that we're starting to look at, like silver linden as opposed to American linden, which shows some kind of resistance to Japanese beetles. So we're starting to evaluate that to see what opportunities there are to increase that. Now, when it comes to a linden in your own landscape, if you have room, kind of maybe on your back 40, I would highly recommend planting it. Like in the picture here, it's right in front of a house. If Japanese beetles are bad in your area, you might not choose this particular tree for that high profile location. Sycamore, on the other hand, is a lovely tree. Japanese beetles don't bother it at all, although when they're really hungry, they'll eat anything, kind of like a deer will. You'll see sycamores all over Des Moines, really everywhere. But Des Moines, they went through an age about, maybe 50 years ago where sycamores were incredibly popular to plant. And so you'll see a lot of really gorgeous old sycamores throughout Des Moines and kind of the older parts of town. And they're quite gorgeous, especially if you love variegated bark. They have such unique bark. You can spot them a mile away. And they're very long-lived, great, excellent, huge shade trees. They're native, but they're also great for pollinators too. You can see here this little picture up in the top right corner. Those are sycamore flowers, and they're actually groupings of flowers. And that's something that's important to remember when it comes to pollinators. They like what I call one-stop shopping. They don't want to have to go to 5 different stores to get all their groceries. They want to go to one and get everything. And so when you have a flower that has lots of little tiny flowers, if it's a flower cluster, a pollinator is going to prefer that because they don't have to travel very far and expend a lot of energy to go from one flower to the next to fill up their honey stomach or their corbicula. I think I flubbed the word. Anyway, so keep that in mind, and that's a recurring theme that you'll see throughout this presentation, small flowers clustered closely together. And now when it comes to the ornamental value of the flowers, they are not really something that people are going to notice that much. They're not showy flowers, so you may not notice that they're there, and when they are there, they may be very high up in the canopy, and so you don't see them, but rest assured, they're there, and the pollinators are having a feast. Now, when it comes to showy flowers, we'll talk about catalpa. There's northern catalpa, that's the Catalpa speciosa, and southern catalpa, which is quite possibly my favorite Latin name, Catalpa bignonioides. I just love saying bignonioides. I think it's awesome. But what's great about catalpa is that they have amazingly showy flowers. And these flowers here, you see the pictures on the screen, they're large. They're an inch or more across, and they're in clusters. And here you can see this full tree just loaded with flowers from top to bottom. It's a showy, amazing tree. The foliage on a catalpa is huge heart-shaped leaves. It really looks like some kind of a tropical specimen that shouldn't be native to the US, but it absolutely is native, and it's just a very cool tree. It can take wet soils, so if you have kind of a soggy situation, definitely consider a catalpa. It does get pretty large too, and it hits these really interesting kind of bean-like seed pods. Another thing that makes it look incredibly exotic, the seed pods, and people just kind of stop and look when they're walking down the sidewalk and they see a catalpa. So it's a fun one. Black locust, you'll see black locust everywhere. It is what we call an advantageous species. Oftentimes when there's disturbed forests or disturbed maybe gray fields, the first trees that start populating back in will be something like black locust, which is a native plant. Another one would be Siberian elm, which is not native, not necessarily one that we would encourage at all. But black locust is okay. It's the first round of trees that are going to come in and repopulate a disturbed site. Now, if anybody's grown or dealt with black locust in their woods or in their fence line, the first thing you're going to know is that they're thorny, and they can be incredibly thorny, which makes them hard to pull out if you don't want them there. So you're going to have to wear some heavy gloves if you're doing some thinning. Another thing you'll notice is that they seed and sucker like crazy. And so if you have one locust, you'll have several locusts within a matter of years. So with that being said, they are great plants for pollinators. They go through a kind of, every few years, they'll go through a really heavy bloom cycle. They bloom a little bit every year, but I notice every few years, 3 to 5 years, they'll have an extremely heavy bloom. And they will be absolutely incredibly fragrant and quite lovely. The fall foliage is quite nice, and of course the pollinators do love those pretty flowers. Black cherry, here's another one where we talk about lots of flowers and clusters together. You can see all these tiny little flowers. I don't find the tree to be particularly fragrant, but it is quite nice and quite charming when it's in bloom in the springtime. It's a native tree. It has a great kind of a fountain-like habit when it's fully mature. It's quite large, 80 feet tall, sometimes taller, with kind of this nice upright vase and then kind of weeping branches that come down after that. If you have a driveway or a parking lot that's under a black cherry, you probably know when it's fruiting season, because they do have these really dark purpley red berries. Birds absolutely love them. This is a great habitat plant for pollinators and for birds and squirrels and other wildlife that like to eat the fruit. But you will notice the ramifications of that fruit on your windshield, on your car, in the form of dropped fruit or bird poop and things like that. So if you're going to do a black cherry, maybe don't put it right by your driveway. Oh, here is one of my absolute favorites. This is the black tupelo, sometimes called black gum, or just plain tupelo, and Nyssa sylvatica if you want to get Latin with it. This is a vastly underappreciated native tree. It is absolutely gorgeous year-round. Great green, lustrous green foliage throughout the spring and summer. You see here, this is one of the tupelos we have at the Arboretum in fall color. This fellow here is Brenton. He's our founder. He does not like to have his picture taken, so whenever I sneak a picture, it's usually him walking away. But I couldn't withstand the opportunity to get a picture of him with this just spectacular fall color on this Tupelo. And you can notice from the trees in the background, most everything else has already lost its leaves for the fall, and this one is still hanging on, still going strong with the foliage, and so it gets late fall color. And when it does get it, it is just scarlet. It is so pretty. The flowers are nothing to write home about. You can see them here. There's lots in one place. And so the pollinators like to go to it because they can fill up without having to spend a lot of energy. So you're not going to plant this one for a big floral show. It's about the foliage almost entirely. It is a native plant. It takes full sun. It can get pretty big. I'm going to show you my next slide. There's a more mature Tupelo with that amazing layer cake kind of branching habit. This picture just makes me absolutely weak in the knees. It's so pretty. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is the Kentucky coffee tree. And that is one that we especially love at the Brenton Arboretum because we have an accredited collection of coffee tree, and that takes a lot of red tape and hoops to jump through to achieve accreditation for a plant collection. And so we're really proud of that fact. It's something that the botanists and the scientists kind of ooh and ah over, but the typical visitor may not, well, maybe they don't particularly appreciate it to that level. But the coffee tree collection that we have is large. It's almost, I think we have nearly 100 trees planted, pretty darn close to 100 trees in our collection. And they're a gorgeous tree, and like the Tupelo, highly underrated. You don't see them nearly enough in the market or at nurseries. And the reason is because they can be a little awkward looking when they're young. They kind of have an ugly duckling scenario, but they do grow into beautiful swans. When it comes to the Kentucky coffee tree, you have to remember that they are dioecious. There's male and female trees, and the female trees will have the heavier flower load with pollen and nectar. So you'll need to be sure that you have a female if you want to get a pretty heavy pollinator impact. The males will to a certain extent, but it's the females that are really going to attract them. Now the females will also be the ones that produce these big giant seed pods, which are really, really cool. They look tropical and foreign. This is a native tree, Kentucky coffee tree. You can kind of guess from its name that it is native. The coffee tree comes from the fact that I think back maybe in the Civil War days, when coffee was short in supply, and those who were extremely desperate for a cup of joe would experiment and try roasting and grinding and then brewing the seeds from the Kentucky coffee tree. Our director of horticulture, Andy, found a graduate research paper in which the student had tested all different ways to grind, temperatures to roast, and lengths to roast, and how to brew and what temperature to brew with to make the best cup of coffee from the Kentucky coffee tree seeds. And the answer was, there is no way to make a decent cup of coffee. So don't plant coffee tree and expect to get coffee out of it. You're still gonna have to buy your Folgers at the grocery store. But do consider planting the tree because it is quite lovely. I wanted to put in a young and old picture of Kentucky coffee tree to kind of demonstrate the ugly duckling scenario. You see over here, this is a young Kentucky coffee tree here on the left side of the screen. And this one's been pruned and is in really good shape, but you can kind of get the idea. It's got kind of this ugly duckling, awkward, I call it angles and elbows. It's kind of a teenager scenario where it's just hasn't really grown into itself yet. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you don't see it very often in nurseries is because you look at it in the pot at the nursery and you think, I don't know, I don't think I'm going to buy that. It looks weird or goofy relative to a red maple or something like that. But have faith. Once it gets out of its kind of awkward stage and matures into a really lovely, beautiful tree, like this one here on the right side of the screen, it is absolutely a stunner. And great vase-shaped habit, amazing kind of golden marmalade fall color, and really nice street tree too, because it goes up and can be pruned to be up and stay off of sidewalks and roadways and things like that. So really worth looking for and asking for at your local tree nursery. American yellowwood. We do have a couple of yellowwood at the Arboretum, not a lot. I think we're just on the edge of its happy zone. Tends to get a little cold for this one, but it is really quite lovely. It is absolutely one that you would plant for a floral show, because you see these amazing pendulous flowers, very fragrant. It's called yellowwood because when you cut into it, the wood inside is actually pretty bright yellow. Obviously, it's got great fall color too, and so that's a great tree. A little bit on the smaller side. It's not going to be like a giant oak. So if you have more of a neighborhood setting or a suburban setting, and you would like taller trees but not overwhelmingly huge trees, you might consider the yellowwood. Sourwood is another one that you might consider, kind of along those same lines. This one, it has these little bell-shaped flowers. To me, it's not as floriferous or as much of a floral show as the yellowwood, but it's still quite lovely. Obviously, a pretty spectacular red fall color. This one is another one that's going to be just marginally hardy here. So if you want to grow it, you'll probably want to find a protected spot, maybe surrounded by a brick wall or in a courtyard or something along those lines, just to help keep it protected from winter snow and wind. Buckeyes. Everybody in the Midwest loves a buckeye, right? Especially if you're from Ohio. But buckeyes do really well here in Iowa as well. There's several different kinds, and many of them are they're all popular with pollinators. And the classic one is the Ohio buckeye, Aesculus glabra. There's another one that's the bottlebrush buckeye, which is more of a shrub. I have a picture of it on the next slide. It's great for landscape settings, maybe doing shrub borders and things like that. Now, another one I definitely want to be sure and mention is the European horse chestnut, which is an Aesculus. It's in the buckeye family. The European horse chestnut, and I have a picture of it on the next page, this big large one here, it is not native to the US, but you will find it here. There's one actually just a few streets up from me in my neighborhood that is absolutely a stunner. It's right on the road to the elementary school, and I think I caught myself once just slamming on my brakes when it was in bloom to just take it in. It's absolutely amazing. So one to look for if you have the space. It gets quite large. And here you can see all the different flower clusters that they have. This is the bottlebrush buckeye. Beautiful, beautiful shrub for the landscape. I will say that we observe at the Brenton Arboretum, it does tend to get a little bit of summer scorch or some fungal issues. So it sometimes looks a little tired towards the end of the summer, a little browned out, a little burned towards late August or September. If we have a mild summer that's not so terribly harsh, then it'll look fresh throughout the year. So keep that in mind as you're designing your border. Maybe you want it there, but then other things to kind of take over the view once it's out of bloom. Sugar maples. Jacqueline and I were talking about sugar maples just before our program. She has a sugar maple in her backyard, which I think is so much fun to be able to have one of those in your own yard and actually maybe tap it for maple, the maple syrup or things like that. We do have sugar maple at the Arboretum as well. We have, gosh, all kinds of maples out there. We have a pretty big maple collection. When it comes to choosing a maple for pollinators, I specifically recommend the red maple and the sugar maple. Silver maple, Freeman maples, some of the other ones that you'll find, black maples, they're not as popular with pollinators. They will go to it, they do flower, but if you really want to have pretty high impact pollinator plant, look for the sugar maple or the red maple. So I think those are ones to search for. I have a note here about the classic street tree. It's becoming overplanted. I don't want to disparage red maple. I have red maple on my street right here at my house, and I absolutely love them. However, there are so many maples in urban or suburban overstories that people are starting to worry about the lack of diversity. And you hear the word diversity a lot. It's very important to try and maintain a diverse plant population because it builds resiliency when it comes to things like emerald ash borer or oak disease, chestnut blight, all these different things that can pop up and rear their ugly heads and wipe out a population of trees. And if that's all you have in your neighborhood, you're in real bad luck because they might all be gone. And then you have to start over from scratch, which is what a lot of neighborhoods that planted a lot of ash trees are experiencing now. Back in the 60s, that was the issue with the American elm, getting the elm disease. Whole neighborhoods were just completely wiped out of their street trees. So diversity is key. And while red maple is beautiful, look around before deciding to put one in your own neighborhood or on your own street and just see, is that the only thing there? And if it is the only thing there, maybe choose something else. Be different, stand out. Tulip tree. I love the tulip tree. You can see how it got its name. Its flowers look like tulips. But the interesting thing about that is that you're not very likely to actually spot a tulip tree flower because they're very high up in the canopy of the tree. A young tulip tree, you'll probably find one, or if a branch snaps in a storm in the springtime, it might fall to the ground and you get a chance to look at it. But typically, the flowers are going to be pretty high up and out of sight, which is a shame because they are quite large. They are 2 or 3 inches across and very showy, but they're up there. So good luck finding them. The bees find them though. They know how to make their way up there and get to that particular tree. Tulip poplars in our neck of the woods are definitely marginally hardy. I gardened for several years over in Omaha at Lauritsen Gardens, and we had a really, really bad cold snap. I believe that Iowa had the same cold snap as well. It was a very dry, very cold winter about 5 or 6 years ago. And some nice tulip trees that we had, quite large, solid 8 inches in diameter, they died all the way down to the ground. So it was a real shame that such large trees suddenly got killed back. But on the positive side, they started sprouting again from the roots. So they were root hardy. They just weren't hardy in that particularly cold winter. So keep that in mind. Like I think we talked about the sourwood needed a little bit of protection. The tulip tree might need a little bit of a protected spot as well, which is especially hard because it can get so big. It can definitely reach 90 feet, sometimes more if it's happy. But that can be hard to find a protected spot for a tree that size. All right, we're going to scoot along over to the beeest small trees and shrubs for bees. Of course, I cannot talk about trees for bees without talking about orchard trees. And I'm not going to dive in deep on specific kinds of trees, but apples, pears, peaches, plums, sour cherries, persimmon, they are all great for pollinators. We hear a lot about how the orchards throughout the United States, you hear a lot about in California, they don't have enough bees, and people will actually put bees on semi-trucks and then truck them from one end of the state to the other following the bloom season so that the bees can pollinate those crops, and then you can have a good fruit set. So if you keep any kind of orchard fruits, you might consider finding some bees. The bees will find you, whether you're getting the honey from them or not. You will have bees in your orchard. And if you are particularly interested in getting specific orchard recommendations, the Iowa Extension has some fantastic resources. The fruit trees for the upper Midwest is great. So always look to your extension. I'll give a shout out to the Iowa State University and the Iowa Extension because they are fantastic for those kinds of in-depth questions, and they keep their information fresh. They're constantly reevaluating and evaluating new cultivars that come out and new science. So it's not the same recommendations that you would have had in the 40s or the 50s or even the 80s or the 90s. So it's constantly being looked at, and a great resource for farmers and home gardeners. Let's see here. There we go. Crabapple. The crabapple is one of the most popular trees in the springtime at the Brenton Arboretum. We have a really nice collection of them. They're displayed beautifully on a hillside. They're quite early blooming, so they're a great resource for the bees early in the year because they can get that pollen and nectar source pretty early, early on. In general, they are a small tree. They don't get very big. They're great for smaller yards and neighborhoods. And they come in just about every shade you can imagine, from white to deep red, purple, pink. They come in every shape, from upright, weeping, columnar, low growing almost to the ground, kind of a habit as well. So if there's a particular shape or a color you're looking for, there's probably a crabapple that's been hybridized that would fit the bill. I do always recommend looking for crabapple cultivars and hybrids that have disease resistance, specifically fire blight, because that can be a real issue for crabapples, especially during very humid summers. And they just get fungal issues all over the foliage. They defoliate, they can be unattractive. So look for those disease-resistant ones, and there are plenty of them out there. So do a little research before you spend the money. Here's a few more. The picture down here on the bottom left is the Crabapple Hill out at the Arboretum. Similar to crabapple in habit and shape is the redbud. This one is going to be much more of an understory tree. You'll find this one in woods with high shade, tall trees with the branches and canopy way up high. So filtered light getting down through to the understory underneath those trees. The redbuds are a pretty short blooming specimen, so they're not going to be weeks and weeks and weeks of color on the red bud, but when they are in bloom, it's so early, and usually there's not foliage out in the rest of the forest or the landscape, and it's one of those signs of spring, and it feels so good to see them. And then of course the bees and pollinators are excited to see them too, because it's another early source for food for them. It's interesting, there's red bud, the purple one, and then there's also a white flowered red bud, which you would think would be called a white bud, but it's not. It's a white red bud. It's kind of confusing. You'd think they would have chosen a different name for it, but that they are available out there in the market. This one tends to be a short-lived tree. People get really upset sometimes when their tree is 15 or 20 years old and it starts to decline. So I would say don't be discouraged though, because red bud seeds itself very easily and also resprouts from the roots once the older original tree has passed its kind of life expectancy. It's really common for them to sprout and form their own little thickets. So if you have a red bud and it's starting to look a little old, look a little tired, as you're pulling weeds, check out and see which one of those are going to be red buds. They are very distinctive foliage, big heart-shaped leaves, so they're easy to spot and differentiate from other weeds. And then decide maybe you'll keep that one. Don't pull it. Put a little cage around it with some chicken wire and grow it on. And then that way, as the older, more mature tree continues to decline, you have some progeny starting to grow where you want them and take the place. Okay, here is Amermachia. Now, I had never heard of this tree before I got to Iowa a few years ago. We didn't have any at the Arboretum, but all of our advisors and botanical experts who are helping us with our collections had said, you need Machia. You need Machia. You got to have Machia. It was on every recommended list. And I said, well, everybody's recommending it. What the heck is it? So we finally bit the bullet and got some Machia. So they're quite young. And the information I can relay to you is what I have researched. It's not firsthand experience because we've just barely been growing them at the Arboretum. But they are a non-native tree. So but they have been evaluated and don't appear to have any issues with seeding or becoming invasive. But we do definitely keep our eye on that just in case. They are from Asia, and they have a really pretty amazing summer bloom. Many of the things, they'll bloom in the springtime or they'll bloom in the fall. This one is a solid summer bloomer. So it's providing food at an interesting point of the year when there may not be as many other things blooming tree-wise for the plants. They like full sun. They tend to be on the smaller side, a little bit bigger than a crab apple usually, and they are reported to be very fragrant. I haven't experienced that myself because ours are too young to flower just yet. So my fingers are crossed that they're going to start flowering in the next year or two, and we'll get a whiff. Japanese tree lilac, another non-native summertime bloomer. You see these all over the place in neighborhoods, parking lots, shopping centers. You're going to see Japanese tree lilac. They are fragrant. I don't particularly enjoy the fragrance. Some people really do. I find it a little, I don't know, a little off for me, a little musky. But if it's a fragrance you like, you got plenty of it because there's plenty of flowers. Billowy clouds of flowers. You could see, you know, this would just be kind of the golden corral for bees and pollinators because there's just so much there for them to feast on. These are grape trees, quite lovely, not native. Sometimes that's okay. Seven sunflower is another non-native. I think I'm in the non-native department of my program. Heptacodium is the Latin name for this one. This plant has really cool exfoliating bark. It can be grown as a tree. It's more often grown as kind of a large multi-stem shrub or sub-tree. This one is fun because it blooms in fall. And so it's yet another great food source at a time when bees have a little bit less of a choice in the landscape. So think of that late season food source for the pollinators. And the Seven Suns will be a good one for this one. This one is blooming right now at the Arboretum. And it's one of those you can just walk by it and the whole shrub just hums with the pollinators buzzing all around it. It's a fun experience. Winterberry, this is a great native. So we're back to native here. Native fruit-bearing plant. Lots of little flowers, not really showy flowers, but the pollinators do love them. What they're known for, of course, is their winter berry set, fruit set. They are just loaded with the berries. The birds love this particular plant because of that heavy berry set in the wintertime. It's kind of at odds though, because when you have heavy berry set that's quite beautiful, if the birds like it, the birds will eat it all up and you've lost all your berries. But if they don't eat them all up, well, the birds didn't like the berries. So it's sometimes you kind of have to weigh one hand or the other. There are many, many different cultivars of this particular plant. One of the things you have to remember is that winterberry is another dioecious plant. There's male and female, and to get the fruit set, you have to have both. So you have to have a male and you have to have a female. Usually in a neighborhood setting, there's going to be a male somewhere within a 5-mile radius that will be able to cross-pollinate with the female and get the fruit set. What nurserymen have started doing these days is actually when they root plants in a nursery pot, they'll root a female and a male right next to each other, and then they'll grow together as one single shrub, not half and half, but just together all as one. So you have a male and a female literally just growing together as if it's one plant, and you have both the male and the female, and they can do their business. So that's a good one to look out for, and an important one to remember about the male and the female requirement. Serviceberry is another beautiful, beautiful native understory shrub, small tree. This one typically is an understory. It likes the woodland situation or edge of a woodland situation. However, I'm seeing more and more of them planted in full sun, and they're doing just fine. So they can handle a full sun situation, even though they are typically found in a woodland setting. Great spring blooms, great berry set. The animals love them. They're edible for humans as well, if you can get to them before the squirrels do, which is not the easiest thing in the world, but you can eat them and make jams and jellies and things like that. They're becoming incredibly popular for their fall color. They're doing some great hybridization to really intensify and select for fall color. So here you can see in the bottom middle picture, I think this one is one called Autumn Brilliance. which is a spectacular fall show. Definitely one worth checking out. Now, the ones that are pollinated by flies have developed a scent to attract flies. Guess what flies like? They like rotten meat. That's kind of gross, but if you pick a particular species, if I burn them, it might end up smelling like rotten meat when it blooms. Most of the ones that you're going to find in nurseries today are going to be the sweet smelling kind, more pleasant to human noses, and also very welcome to pollinators as well. Lots of different species and cultivars and interspecific hybrids and things like that that are excuse me, not interspecific, that's not the right word. Anyway, hybrids that are great. Okay, let's move on. Staghorn sumac, a fantastic native plant. This one tends to be kind of a colonizing plant. It will walk around, I like to say, in the landscape. You plant it in one place and it will colonize out around, and the original might die, but then colonies might spread to another location and inhabit that spot. So if you plant sumac, keep in mind it may decide where it wants to be and move itself there eventually through the process of colonizing. But it does have great floral interest in the springtime. Lots of bees and butterflies love it. And then the fall color just really can't be beat. When you're driving down the interstate, you can tell when you've come across a patch of sumac because it's just brilliantly scarlet all up and down the sides of the interstate. And I think you probably know, you probably have experienced that driving in Iowa. Pussy willow is a fun one. It's an extremely early bloomer. I'm surprised that there's insects out almost. That's how early it is, but there are insects out and they are looking for something to eat. Usually it's the first emergence from the hive, and the pussy willows can be a really good choice for them. People use these a lot for decorating. They'll cut pussy willow branches and put them in vases in the house, and that's a really fun way to use the pussy willow. In the landscape, it's great in wet areas. So if you have a particularly soggy corner of your yard, a pussy willow might be a really good choice for you. Elderberry. This is another one that does like tolerate wet soils. The elderberry is lovely. It is native. There's European, but then there's also American elderberry. I find that it tends to be a very floppy shrub. It likes to kind of flop and lay over and sprawl a little bit. So you got to have a little bit of a tolerance for kind of a lazy shrub in the landscape. It's not going to be prim and proper. It's going to flop and do what it wants. But when it is happy, it gets covered in blooms and then covered in berries too. So it's great for pollinators and for other wildlife like birds and squirrels. And you can make elderberry wine and elderberry jam, all kinds of things like that, which is fun. Hawthorn is a spring bloomer, often used similarly to crabapple. I recommend hawthorn less and less just because it does have so many issues with fungus and powdery mildew. Mostly I find that it's completely lost its foliage by midsummer. And as a matter of fact, the hawthorn collection that we have at the Arboretum, we removed most of and relocated a couple and replaced that with the Macchia that I talked about a few slides back. When a hawthorn is happy though, and when it's in full bloom and doing a really great job, it is a stunner. You just have to know you're going to have some fungal issues with it. Here's a few more. Here's like the 1 year, this bottom picture is the 1 year that they did beautifully at the Arboretum and didn't lose their foliage before they were able to get fall color. Buttonbush is Cephalanthus. There's a fun cultivar of buttonbush called Sputnik, and you can see the flower here, why it might be called Sputnik, like the Russian satellite. It's kind of a fun thing. This one is a native shrub. It loves wet settings. You'll find it often near lakes or along stream sides, and it's a great one for pollinators, a great native plant, great habitat plant in general. Okay, we're gonna scoot along to smaller shrubs for bees. Hydrangeas of almost every sort, not the mop head hydrangeas. Avoid those. They're not the best for pollinators, but the other kinds like paniculata, panicle hydrangeas, or arborescens, smooth hydrangea, those are much more popular with bees, and they're also much more hardy and reliable bloomers in the landscape. So I always recommend those over the mop heads in this neck of the woods. Gray and rough dogwoods, if you have woodlands or streams or anything like that on your property, you probably have some of these dogwoods. They can be purchased as ornamental shrubs. They're not as common. They just don't tend to be the super showiest of showy plants, but they are great for habitats, specifically the flowers, and also later on in the season with fruits, and the animals will eat those as well. They colonize really aggressively. So if you plant one shrub, you'll have a giant shrub pretty quickly within a few years. So keep in mind, you might have to whip it into shape if you want to keep a tidy plant and keep it small. You're going to have to do some work to cut away some of the colony. Coralberry is one, it's not as common around here, which surprises me. It's another native shrub, beautiful coral pink berries in the mid-summer towards fall, and it does have quite lovely flowers in the springtime. And this one, they're doing a lot of hybridizing to take it from kind of this wild, wispy woodland ground cover to a more landscape appropriate size, habit, shape, color type of a plant for landscapes. So I expect that this one is going to become more popular as the years go by, and for good reason. It's quite lovely. Spice bush is kind of the wallflower of the native shrubs that you might have in a habitat garden. It's not exactly showy in any situation. The flowers are just kind of small and green and waxy. The bush in the summertime is just green. It does have some good fall color in the fall, but nothing, knock your socks off. But because it is such a great plant for pollinators, and it is worth considering tucking one into your landscape somewhere, just because it's such a great food source for those plants. Fun thing, and the way it got its name, is the foliage. If you crush it, it smells really spicy. So that's how it got the name spice bush. So that's kind of a fun thing. It's a way to make a connection to a plant. Maybe kids love smelling fragrant leaves and things like that. That's a great way to reach out to them. Ninebark is another native plant. I used to not really be a huge fan of ninebark because it was, what I knew of it, it was just this wonky, crusty, floppy shrub. But since then, the nurserymen have been doing some amazing hybridization. And there is every shape, color, size, heavy bloom, disease resistance, and fungus tolerance. And so I'm a converted. I am a ninebark fan at this point and have it in my yard at home. These days, we're starting to recommend ninebark as a really good alternative to barberry. Barberry is that little thorny shrub, tends to be, might be purple or rosy pink or bright red, different colors, different habits. Well, it's not native, and in some places it's becoming invasive. But whenever you might want a barberry, there's probably a physocarpus or a ninebark that will do exactly the job that you would use the ninebark for, or excuse me, the barberry for, but it's native and it's a better habitat plant. So start looking into ninebarks. They're one to keep on your radar because they're easy, low maintenance, and really quite attractive. Chokeberry, or aronia, is another name for this one. In the Midwest, you've probably have heard of aronia, this one of the super fruits for antioxidants. They're also really fantastic landscape plants. Great fall color, really pretty flowers, berries that yes, you can eat them, but you have to add a lot of sugar to make them edible. Kind of makes me wonder, if you have to add so much sugar, does it offset the health benefits? I don't know. I haven't answered that question philosophically, but it's one that's definitely worth growing in your landscape. They tend to be a smaller mounded shrub. There are some that can be up to 5 feet tall, so they can get fairly large as well. But they're originally hybridized as a crop fruit, people are starting to recognize them more as a landscape um, plant, just for beauty and aesthetics. So they kind of are hitting a couple different markets that way and gaining a lot of popularity. We have a big aronia collection at the Arboretum. Sweet pepper bush, clethra is another name for this one. Kind of like the spice bush a few slides back, this one has fragrant foliage as well. Here's one called Crystallina and Ruby Spice. This one, I believe, is going to be a little bit marginally hardy in our neck of the woods. You just don't see it quite as much as you do in maybe the eastern US or southeastern US, but it is quite nice. And if you have a protected spot, it's one that's worth trying out and seeing if it'll do for you. And the bees in your neighborhood will thank you, because they do absolutely love it. And it smells wonderful too. St. John's wort's another small this is almost a perennial in habit. It does have a woody base, so it's technically a shrub, but you'll notice die back in the wintertime and then it'll sprout back out in the springtime. And it's a great one for pollinators as well. And if you're into herbs and herbalism, of course, St. John's wort is a really popular one for that. I'm not going to give you instructions on how to use it because I don't want to accidentally poison anybody. And shrubby cinquefoil is another one. I don't have a tremendous amount of experience with this one, but I have seen it growing really successfully around central Iowa. So I highly recommend giving it a try if you're really looking for that floral show. It's another one that, like St. John's wort, is kind of a subshrub. It'll have dieback in the wintertime, but still have a woody base down at the bottom and resprout from there. Very colorful. Use it almost like you would use a perennial. And cotoneaster, you guys, I think this is my last one of the program. Cotoneaster is a non-native ground cover shrub, and sometimes also called fishbone plant because its branching looks a little bit like fish bones, which is interesting. Great flower, more known for its fruit set and also fall color. It is a ground cover, but it does lose its foliage in the wintertime. It's deciduous. So sometimes people think of ground covers like junipers will be evergreen. This one is not evergreen. You will see the branches in the wintertime. This is very great selection for dry, rocky soils. It does really well in that situation, and bright, full sunshine. It likes that too. So if you're looking for a ground cover, this might be a good choice. All right, now, you guys, we're kind of beyond, but we've gone through all the plants. I have a few slides on fun features that you can add to your garden. There's a bee house for mason bees, this cute little bee hotel for all different kinds of pollinators and bees. So if you're a woodworker and have a hobby shop and want to build something like this, you can really impress your neighbors. Let's see, moving on. Here's another fantastic one. Can you imagine all the little critters that would love to live in this natural wood stick structure here? What a creative and clever thing. This is a bumblebee nest box. Bumblebees are not colony bees. They are solitary bees, but you can kind of help them along with their own little, looks like a little teeny weeny doghouse, but it's for your bumblebee. So that might be something that the bees appreciate. And you guys, this one down here, this is a bee bed, as in the beehive boxes are underneath, and this platform on top with the lid, you lay down inside of it, and then you close the lid on top of yourself. And I don't know exactly what it accomplishes, but apparently somebody thought this was a great idea. So if you're brave and you want to feel bees humming underneath you while you sleep or nap or whatever, this might be something for you to try out. People love it when I show them this and they think, what in the world, that's crazy. But yeah, to each his own, right? Traditional beehives, there's the traditional stacked hives with frames. This is me. These are the beehives that I have at the Arboretum. I don't have any bees this year, but I have kept bees in the past. So these are just traditional hives. You can buy these boxes just about anywhere and knock them together. There are frames that fit down on the inside. This is a hanging frame beehive where it's a bar that goes across the top, and the bees build their own comb down below it rather than building on a frame that's provided for them in the bee boxes. And here's some very clever things to paint them and decorate them and make them your own. Kids love this kind of a project because they can have their own little beehives. If you're very fancy, you can get extra fancy with it. Copper accents, things like that. The traditional bee skeps, the woven bee skeps, are not really used that much anymore, just because to get the honeycomb out, you end up destroying the whole comb and the whole hive just to get them out of the basket, and it sets the bees back pretty far. If you just take them out on a frame, you spin the frame in a centrifuge, the honey slings out, but the comb itself is still intact, and you put it back in, and the bees don't have to start all over again building their comb. So you won't find these much anymore unless it's something quaint or maybe at a living history farm or something like that. All right, if you want to learn more about how to support wildlife in your landscape, your home landscape, I highly recommend these two books. The kind of the holy grail, the Bible for sustaining wildlife in your own landscape is called Bringing Nature Home. It's written by Doug Tallamy. We have copies of this at the Brenton Arboretum Library. I'm willing to bet you can find it at Ryman Garden too. Definitely it's for sale on Amazon. You can find it at Half Price Books. It's a great one to learn how to plant your home landscape to support pollinators, birds, wildlife, squirrels, caterpillars, snakes, raccoons, possum, whatever you want to bring to your yard. This is a great one to help kind of expand the conservation in your own hometown. Then a few years after writing Bringing Nature Home, Doug Tallamy teamed up with Rick Dark, another popular garden writer, to create The Living Landscape, which takes the lessons learned from Bringing Nature Home from the science side of things and entomology side of things, and then adds the aesthetic landscape side of creating beautiful gardens and home landscapes and very livable landscapes. So that's what the other one is here. It is out, I think it came out fairly recently, maybe just a year or so ago. So they're definitely both worth checking out. Let's see. Here's some references and resources. And thank you all for bearing with me. Let's see here. I'm looking through the little chats to see if there are any questions. Yeah, you guys know you're commenting, oh, the Macchia is a great small scale. Thanks for that. That's a message from Ed, and somebody is familiar with the Tupelo that we talked about that I swoon over. So you guys are as big of fans of trees as me. So I like hearing from you guys about those kinds of things. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Thank you for having me give this program. I'm sorry, I told you I could go on and on and on.
No, Melissa, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge. I will tell you, I have a page worth of notes about the things that you were sharing, because after the derecho this year, I definitely have some trees to replace in my yard, and I'm finding more and more that, including a couple of maples, like you were saying. So I'm looking forward to adding some diversity. And I'm also excited because I just recently added a bottle brush buckeye and an amelanchier to my landscape. So hopefully
you are bringing nature home in your very own landscape.
I'll be bringing nature home even more.
Perfect. I'm glad to hear that. I'm sure Doug Tallamy will be glad to hear that too. So
of course. Well, Melissa, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who's been joining us today for this presentation. This has been really informative, super fantastic information, and very inspiring. So I really appreciate it, and I can't wait for my next trip to the Brenton Arboretum.
Well, come on out. It's a great time to visit, and you can play hooky from work, and or just bring your laptop to the Arboretum and do your work.
There we go.
It works.
There we go. That sounds like a good plan.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much to everybody, and we'll be sharing this video on Facebook, and we will look forward to, and if we have any other comments or anything, we'll be sure and let you know. And a reminder, be sure if you have questions, you can go ahead and email us at rgeducation@iastate.edu. And thanks very much to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.